Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and last time Jackson lost the Battle of Kernstown, but achieved a significant strategic goal: keep as many Union soldiers in the valley as possible. Now we move with Jackson through the valley. After Kernstown, Jackson retreated south, but he did not forget about Johnston's orders to keep the Union Army busy. Jackson was proactive, knowing he needed a cartographer. Colonel Baylor introduced Jedediah Hotchkiss to Jackson. When they met in late March, the two men talked about Hotchkiss's work. Then Jackson said, "I want you to make me a map of the valley, from Harper's Ferry to Lexington, showing all the points of offense and defense in those places." At that point, Hotchkiss left Jackson's headquarters and began his task. On April 1st, Jackson placed Richard Garnett under arrest for neglect of duty at Kernstown. The commander believed that his brigadier's decision to quit the field denied the Valley Army of a victory at Kernstown. Garnett, under guard, went to Harrisonburg without knowing the specifications of the charge against him. He would be replaced by Charles Winder. Winder was a Marylander, a West Point graduate, and a known disciplinarian, which would not gain him much love from the troops whose commander he replaced. On the Union side, Shields placed a moratorium on outgoing mail so that he could get the first word to the Union High Command and the newspapers about the battle. His battle description was simply fantasy, claiming that he had ordered the artillery placements and the attack on Sandy Ridge, all from his sickbed. He wrote, "The havoc which has been made in the ranks of the rebels has struck a blow such as they nowhere else endured since the commencement of the war. Jackson and his Stonewall Brigade and all the other brigades accompanying him will never meet this division again in battle." The letters he sent out sparked the Secretary of State William Seward to visit the battlefield on March 28th, along with his children. However, men in Shields' command knew the truth. One soldier wrote, "I suppose you might have read General Shields' private letter about the battle at Winchester. A more barefaced series of Irish romances I never read. The man actually has the gall to connect his fortunate blunders into a chain of shrewd stratagems, and with after-event wisdom to glorify him." Kimball also knew the truth and hoped that correct reports would validate his actions at the Battle of Kernstown. Jackson's attack at Kernstown complicated the Union strategy. As McClellan moved for the peninsula with his juggernaut of an army, General McDowell with around 30,000 men encamped along the Potomac near Fredericksburg, and Banks was supposed to join McDowell to make demonstrations against the Confederate capital from the north. However, now Lincoln and his cabinet feared that if they sent forces from the valley to McDowell's command, then that would expose Washington, D.C. to Jackson's army. So Banks' command was to stay in and near the valley. To add to Union security, John C. Fremont took control of the Mountain Department, encompassing most of what is now West Virginia. But although he had around 25,000 men on paper, present for duty numbers was around 22,000, and all of those were spread around the region with little supplies or means of transportation. Banks was tasked with pushing Jackson out of the valley and positioning himself to not let the Confederate leader back into the region. With Williams' division recalled from going east, Banks sought to follow his orders and push Stonewall south. Williams marched his men to Woodstock, fighting Ashby's cavalry, supplemented with infantry along the way. Gordon, one of Williams' brigade commanders, wrote, "Ashby was as cool and brave as he was experienced. I think our men had a kind of admiration for the man, as he sat unmoved upon his horse and let our men pepper away at him as if he enjoyed it." Jackson moved his division south of Mount Jackson to Rude's Hill as the Federal forces got closer. The Union push south stopped a little south of Woodstock. The Corps lacked sufficient transportation for their supplies, and the wagons that did catch up to them suffered because of the poor horses and muddy roads resulting from the heavy rains in late March and early April. One Federal officer recalled that after the Battle of Kernstown, his men were issued new shoes, but those wore out in 2 weeks because of the shoddy construction, and most of his men were barefoot. After a 15-day rest, waiting for supplies to catch up to his command, Banks moved on Mount Jackson, hoping to capture Newmarket. Banks formed up his corps in front of Rude's Hill, preparing to launch an attack on Jackson's lines, but Stonewall withdrew toward Harrisonburg, keeping in contact with Richard Ewell's 8,500-man division to the east, the only major Confederate force between himself and Johnston at Richmond. From there, Jackson traveled around the tip of the Massanutten Mountains, putting distance between himself and the approaching Federal troops. Then his division moved to just beyond Conrad's store near Swift Run Gap, the location where Ewell was to meet him if called upon. The Valley Army had marched 50 miles in 3 days. The people of Stanton, with their stores of ammunition and clothing for the Confederate armies, panicked at the thought of Jackson abandoning them. But Jackson's movement would help protect Stanton. If Banks moved on the town, he could hit them in the flank. Otherwise, Union forces would pursue him instead of going toward the town. Banks did march to and occupy Harrisonburg. Due to the discipline of many of the officers, actions against the people of Harrisonburg were minimal, and many sold their goods to Union soldiers looking to supplement their bland army rations with something different. Jackson's army got reorganized while near Swift Run Gap. Under the mandate of the Conscription Act, regiments were to hold elections to choose officers. However, an officer returned to the valley at this time, William B. Tolliver. He had been a vocal opponent of Jackson for Stonewall's actions during the Romney expedition and had resigned, but now he returned to replace Fulkerson at the head of that brigade. Also, Colonel Jesse Burks went on extended sick leave, placing Colonel John A. Campbell of the 48th Virginia at the head of the brigade. Part of Ashby's cavalry patrolled to the north to prevent any Union forces from getting into the rear of Jackson's army. Banks wired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton that Jackson was on his way to Johnston on the peninsula, and there was little else to do in the valley, so he pulled back to Newmarket. At that town, Banks used the gap in the mountains to test Jackson's strength. He sent Sullivan's brigade to do the probing, but Banks saw no reason for his command to stay that far south if Jackson was leaving. But Jackson was not leaving. He was planning his next move. He proposed a few options to General Robert E. Lee, military advisor to President Jefferson Davis. One, he was to travel down the valley toward Front Royal to draw Banks further north, or he could link up with Brigadier General Edward Johnson, who was further west, and attack advanced Union threats in western Virginia. Lee let Jackson decide, and Stonewall chose to link up with Johnson, knowing that Banks's force was still too large to attack even if he combined his and Ewell's forces.